Welcome to a special episode of Bible Study, Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel. So this is a special episode that I've been working on for a while now, doing research and trying to write it out. It didn't really work to write it out, so I'm going to do this one free form. It's got a lot of moving parts, as they say. And so I felt it'd be better to do it free form, and I think I'm going to cut it up, break it up into pieces. So I'm going to have these musical interludes, which I've had before in episodes. We've had fewer and fewer of them, and usually they're just a little bit of a drum roll sometimes, and I just insert them in there so people have a chance to stop and think. It kind of breaks it up a little bit. But this one, the music interludes may be a little bit longer and more intentional to break this up because it gets kind of complicated and there are a lot of moving parts. What this episode is about is Jesus' attitude toward priests, temples, and sacrifices or sacrificial systems. Now, my position, and some of you may have picked up on this as you were listening. For some of you, it may not have been any issue at all. Other people may have liked it. Some people might have wondered about it, and especially people in academia might have even had a problem with it. I don't know the position of people listening. But my position is, it would be a little controversial in academia among scholars. There are some scholars that agree with me, but most of scholarship is moving in a different direction. My position is that Jesus, as presented in the Gospel of Matthew, and I think the other Gospels as well, opposes priesthoods, temples, and sacrificial systems. Now, notice I use the plural of those, not the singular. Usually the way it's talked about, when it is talked about in scholarship among scholars, is that it's the question of, does Jesus oppose the priesthood, the temple, and the sacrificial system? Because they're talking about it just within Israel. Does Jesus oppose these things within Israel? But my argument is actually broader than that. I don't think Jesus is just opposing these things within Israel. Jesus is opposing these things more broadly because the whole first century Mediterranean world had priesthoods and temples and sacrificial systems, not just Israel. There were some things that were unique to Israel's temple and priesthood and sacrificial system. It was monotheistic. You only made sacrifices at the temple. That was different than other places where you could make sacrifices outside the temple, and they were polytheistic. But these things, sociologically, they were very similar. And in all cases, they were the apparatus of the ruling class to maintain their power and to control the people. That's how it functioned throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. So my argument is that Jesus, because of that, opposed all temples, priesthoods, and sacrificial systems. But when we're reading about him, he's operating in Galilee, within Israel. Jerusalem is the center. So we mainly, not exclusively, and we'll get to that in a future episode, but we mainly get to see him in opposition to the temple in Jerusalem and the priesthood in Israel. But the reason Jesus is opposed to these things, I'm arguing, has got to do with power, not with religion. And that is part of what is going on here. So there's this move in scholarship to place Jesus in his Jewish context. And that I agree with. That needs to be done. For too long, Christian scholars, the church, treated Jesus as if Jesus wasn't Jewish. And this has been very useful for people who wanted to oppress Jewish people. This has gone hand in hand with a lot of anti-Semitism. And it's also just the way people tend to read the text from their own vantage point. So if you're a Lutheran, then Jesus becomes a Lutheran, or if you're a Catholic, Jesus becomes a Catholic, But Jesus wasn't any sort of Christian. Jesus was a Jew or a Judean. Scholars will debate on what the proper terminology is. I'll use either one of them. A Jew or a Judean living in Galilee. He was also a Galilean. And we need to understand him in that context. But then what happens is, so people say, well, he wouldn't oppose the priesthood and the temple and the sacrificial system because these were part of Judaism, and Jesus was a Jew, so Jesus wouldn't oppose Judaism. But right there, I think a mistake is being made, and that is using the term Judaism, because that has a connotation for us of a religion. That makes it a religious thing, that this is this opposition then, whether it exists or not, would be a religious opposition. And that, I think, is anachronistic. As I've argued before in this podcast series, religion did not exist in the ancient world the way it does today. It wasn't a separate thing. What we think of as religion was just the way everybody saw the world. It pervaded everything. It was deeply embedded in everything. So Jesus isn't opposing his religion. We need to place Jesus in the traditions of his people in ancient Israel, but we need to understand that everything was political, that what we think of as religious stuff was primarily socio-political for them. It told them who they were, who their people were. And so, which gods you worshiped, which temple you worshiped at, what sacrifices you made was all determined by your tribe and your nation. It was a political thing or a socio-political thing. And so that's what we have to understand Jesus in. He's in a socio-political context. And within that, people can protest or object to certain parts of their own tradition, certain parts of their own culture. And that was actually pretty common in the Jewish tradition, in the Israelite tradition. The prophets had objected to the authorities, to the ruling class, the things they did, and even their institutions. And I'm going to argue that although some critiques of the temple and the priests and the sacrificial system were critiques just on the corruption, not critiques of the institution of the temple establishment itself, or the temple itself, or the priesthood itself, or sacrifices in and of themselves, there were other critiques that were abolitionist, that they said that it's too corrupt, or it's that within the prophets, and I think even in other parts of the Hebrew Scriptures, you find points of view that want to abolish things that you might think of as Israelite institutions, and if you think of it as in a religious thing, and because religion has a way of making us think that everything is sort of static and bound, so you have to be faithful within the religion. You couldn't oppose certain things, but even within religion, that happens all the time. People throw out whole doctrines and whole institutions. That happens even within religion, but for some reason, religion makes us think that can't happen. So if you make it a religious category, then Jesus can't oppose the priesthood because the priesthood is part of Judaism and he's a Jew. But if he is in a socio-political context and these things are socio-political, then that helps us understand that it can be a political protest, a political position within Israel, and that the prophets took these positions. And I'm going to point out later a text in Isaiah that I think is not alone, but that it critiques in an abolitionist way the sacrificial system. The same with the monarchy. The monarchy you could think of as an ancient Israelite institution that could not be opposed. I mean, so many texts talk about it as sacrosanct, But then there are other texts that don't. There is the text where the people clamor for a king, and Samuel tries to warn them, yeah, you guys, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't want a king. And God says to tell Samuel to tell them, look, by choosing a king, you are rejecting me. God says you are rejecting me. And then tells Samuel to tell them to go on and tell them about how the king will oppress them. And he ticks off all the ways the king will oppress them. Well, that's before Saul and David and all the kings. So there you have in Israel's Bible an anti-monarchy text that says by choosing a king, they were rejecting God. So Jesus can object to these institutions that others would consider sacrosanct, but he sees them as tools of the ruling class, and he can have a different interpretation of his own people's traditions and what is most sacred in their tradition. And I think that's how Jesus is presented in the gospel. Yes, very much a Jew, and very much within the prophetic tradition of protesting and rejecting things and power structures that are not just. And I think it's important, again, to point out that sacrificial systems were not unique to Israel. Israel wasn't the only one that had a temple and a priesthood. These were throughout the Mediterranean world. And in fact, throughout the world, you can find, I don't know about animal sacrifice, you definitely can find human sacrifice in all parts of the world. Aztecs, that has been found throughout around the globe. Priests and a sacrificial system. Often it was human sacrifice. But in the ancient Mediterranean world, by the time of Jesus, I don't think there was any human sacrifice going on anymore, or at least it was very marginal, if it was. Definitely not in Israel. And what was going on was animal sacrifice. That was how it was done, and usually with temples and a priesthood. The priesthood could be a designated priesthood, people that were just priests, or it could be a role that someone took on, that a leader took on. But it was usually, especially the upper class priests, were, whether it was a role someone took on or was an office in and of itself, was something that only the ruling class did. Now in Israel there were lower class priests, but the priesthood itself was dominated by the priestly aristocracy, which was part of the ruling class. The high priest in ancient Israel was one of the most powerful people in Jerusalem, second only to the king or the governor that was appointed by Rome. And there was a previous time, right before the Roman period, by the way, the priests were kings. So in the Hasmonean dynasty, which was this very short period of independence before the Roman period, the priests who led the Maccabean revolt, they were the Hasmonean line, they became the kings. So we have to understand that priests were an aristocracy, and that to be a priest was to exercise power, and it is a power dynamic that Jesus is opposing. So there are some scholars that agree with this analysis, and I'll quote a couple of them later, but most are going in a different direction. But that's a lot to take in right now, so let's take a musical interlude at this point. Let's take a break and go stretch or do whatever. Okay, so we're back, and So I want to make one clarification, because a lot of my listeners coming from are within Christian traditions. Not all. I have gotten feedback from listeners that are not Christians that listen to this, but many that are. So, most of them within Western Christian traditions. And there is a Western Christian doctrine that has now, because of Western missionary activity, been taken around the globe. So you'll find it everywhere in Christianity all over the globe now. And that is the idea that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross replaces animal sacrifice. That's what happened. And it's actually got a name, a formal name, this doctrine. If you read theologians, or if you talk to theologians, they call it penal substitutionary atonement. Penal substitutionary atonement. So I'll come back to that, but I just want to say that I want to talk about where sort of mainstream scholarship is going, and then where I'm going with things. And I'll come back to this penal substitutionary atonement, this idea that Jesus replaces animal sacrifice, that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross replaces animal sacrifice. But for right now, I just want to say that is not what most scholars think. That's not where they're going. And that's not where I'm going either. So that's a separate thing. I'll come back to it. But that is something in its strict sense that I'm talking about. And this may be a shock to some Western Christians or some Christians who have absorbed Western Christianity for missionary activity. But that idea of penal substitutionary atonement is one that is only about 400 or 500 years old. I'll come back to it to show that it may seem like it comes straight from the Bible, but it doesn't. So, not at least in its strict, very literal form. So I'll come back to that. But let me talk about where scholarship is going. Now, there isn't one position on Jesus' attitude toward the priesthood and the sacrificial system and the temple in Israel. There's not one position, but there is a general direction in which scholarship is going from the reading I've done, reading the writings of scholars who have written on this. So it's sort of basically this, is that most scholars believe that the earliest followers of Jesus continued to sacrifice at the temple in Jerusalem after Jesus was gone, after Jesus had died and resurrected and ascended into heaven, that whether they believe that literally or not, because not all scholars are believers, just so you know that, but most scholars believe that Christians continued to sacrifice at the temple until it was destroyed in the year 70. Now, the reason for that is that there are a number of texts, even within the New Testament, that indicate that Christians are continuing to sacrifice at the temple. And there's some extra biblical texts as well. But I'm only going to get into 5, I think, that are the most cited by scholars as evidence that Christians continued to sacrifice at the temple. One is Acts chapter 3, where Peter and John are going to the temple. It says at the hour of prayer. They're going for the hour of prayer at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The text specifically says, this is what it says. One day, Peter and John were going to the temple at the hour of prayer at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So that's the NRSV translation. So that's in Acts 3 at the very beginning. I can't remember what verse because I didn't write it down. But Peter and John are going at the hour of prayer. So 3 o'clock in the afternoon was, we know from Josephus, was the time of the afternoon or evening sacrifice. It was called the evening sacrifice, but it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so it sounds like afternoon to us, but they called it the evening sacrifice. And so it appears that Peter and John are going to the temple for that. But it's called the hour of prayer, so it may not be that. And I'll come back to that later. But that's one of the texts that is usually cited to show that Christians were still sacrificing at the temple after Jesus was gone. But that's not the only one. Also in Acts 21 has Paul, the Apostle Paul, agreeing to pay for the sacrifices of 4 men who it appears are needing to get out of a vow they've made, perhaps the Nazirite vow, and Paul agrees to pay for their sacrifices, and he does this to prove his loyalty to the Israelite law. This is something that he's doing to prove his loyalty to the Israelite law. He's going to pay for the sacrifices of these 4 men, and possibly one for himself. It's not clear. They all go and they do the purification rites to prepare, and they set a date for the sacrifices, and then Paul gets arrested before it all happens. So that's one place. Paul was prepared to pay for these sacrifices to prove his loyalty to the Israelite law. So that's another text that gives evidence that that early Christians were still sacrificing at the temple, early followers of Jesus, while the temple still stood, but Jesus was gone. They were still sacrificing at the temple. Another one is in Matthew 5. And that is one that I've already commented on in an earlier episode, but I didn't comment on this aspect of it. When Jesus is talking about reconciliation, he says, if you are making a gift at the altar, if you're offering a gift at the altar, and you remember that your brother, in the original it's brother, it's not brother and sister, because unfortunately people who wrote the Bible wrote in exclusive language. If you remember your brother has something against you, go and be reconciled to him, and then come back and offer your gift at the altar. Now, when many modern Christians, we read this, we kind of blip right over it because, we're especially if we're raised in the church, we think of, the guy's making an offering, and we put our offering in the offering plate, but we know there's some traditions where you go forward. Maybe we've done that before. You go forward to the, quote, altar and put in your offering there. I've done that at times in various churches where that was what they were doing that Sunday. So we think that's what it is, but that's not what it is. In ancient Israel, at that time, when they were talking about making an offering at the altar, they were specifically talking about the temple, and the offering was a sacrificial offering. Maybe not an animal, maybe it was a grain offering, but it was a sacrificial offering. And so this is when you're making an offering at the temple, and then you realize your brother has something against you, go and be reconciled, but then come back and make the offering. Jesus doesn't say don't make the offering. So that is one that is used. Now, I think just because it gets used in teaching of everyday life that some people might experience doesn't mean that Jesus couldn't oppose it. But I'll get back to later why I think Jesus still opposes sacrifices, but the message may sound mixed to us. So anyway, but another one is the Passover meal. The Last Supper seems to have been a Passover meal. And Passover lambs that the central part of the Passover meal is the Passover lamb. Passover lambs were lambs that were sacrificed at the temple. And then you got the meat, and I'm not sure if you bought it or if it was given away. You got the meat and you had your Passover meal. So to participate in Passover was to participate in the sacrificial system. So that's also in Matthew as well as the other Gospels. Also, another Matthew passage that is often pointed out is when Jesus heals the leper. And when he heals the leper in chapter 8, he tells the leper to go to the temple, to the priest at the temple, and make the sacrifices necessary to certify his cleansing. So I've already treated that one in an earlier episode, but I'll come back to that. But those are 5 of the main texts that are used to that are cited as evidence. There are others. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are 5 of the main texts that are cited as evidence that Jesus, that the followers of Jesus continued to sacrifice at the temple after Jesus was gone and before the temple was destroyed. So that's a lot to chew on right there. Let's take a musical interlude, go stretch our limbs, clear our minds, shake our heads, take a nap, whatever, come back. All right. Okay, so we're back. Now, so the question, of course, has to be asked, why did Christians stop sacrificing? And why do scholars think Christians stopped sacrificing? Well, the biggest reason was when the temple was destroyed in the year 70 CE, they could no longer sacrifice. And this was all Jews, not just Christians, not just followers of Jesus. All Jews could no longer sacrifice. And they had to come up with alternative explanations as to how they could live and how they could be faithful to God and to their traditions and everything. So so you have Yohanan ben Zakkai, a major rabbi in the post-70 period, who talks about your good deeds and as sacrifices instead of actual sacrifices in a temple. So and that may be where we get some of the stuff in the New Testament which perhaps seems to be anti-sacrificial. It may just be because the temple was gone, and Christian writers, like other Jewish writers, were having to talk about it and figure out, like, how do we then proceed? It's not clear that Gentile Christians, and the movement from early on brings in Gentiles, it's not clear that Gentile followers of Jesus were required to make sacrifices at the Jerusalem temple. In fact, Acts 21, that in that same passage where Paul agrees to make those sacrifices to prove his loyalty to Israelite law, in that same passage, they mention that Gentiles are not required to do sacrifice. And what it says is that they merely should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication. If they do that, they're good. But notice the first thing. they have to abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols. And this is important. I'll come back to it. Because basically what they're being told in a sense is don't participate in pagan sacrifice. Now you may think that's a given, but actually because sacrifice was so embedded in the ancient world, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, you had to kind of spell that out because sacrifice was everywhere. Sacrificial meat was everywhere. And it would have been actually pretty hard not to participate in pagan sacrifice in some way or another. In fact, when Paul talks about it, now this is what I just talked about here, the Acts 21 passage is in Acts. But when in Paul's actual writings, when Paul talks about it in his writings, he's actually a little bit equivocal about it. He says, don't eat meat sacrificed to idols so as not to make your weaker brother or sister stumble. But for your own conscience, it's no big deal. Yeah, it's, so in and of itself, it's not a bad thing. It's just, don't make someone else stumble. And this has to do with how pervasive sacrifice was in the ancient world. And we'll come back to that because that's an important point. But getting back to the main point of this section that I want to get back to is the reason Christians stopped sacrificing. One was the destruction of the temple in 70. But even before that, Gentile Christians, it seems, were not required to make sacrifices at the Jerusalem temple, but they were being asked not to participate in pagan sacrifices from their own cultures, which is interesting. And some authors have said, distance from, like a lot of Christians weren't Jewish or Gentile Christians, just weren't close to Jerusalem, so they couldn't make the sacrifices. Of course, that was true of Jews in the diaspora as well, but maybe that contributed to Christians no longer making the sacrifice. So anyway, that's why kind of how scholars look at how Christians sacrificing at the Jerusalem temple came to an end. So let's take another break. Okay, we're back. So now you might say, well, what about the texts that speak of Jesus replacing animal sacrifice? So this is coming back to that penal substitutionary view of atonement. Well, as I said, most scholars don't think that that's actually there in Scripture, or they wrestle with it in different ways. Kind of where I've seen a scholarship going on this in terms of Paul's writings is that Paul never actually said don't sacrifice at the temple. And so his writing about Jesus being our sacrifice seems to be metaphor. It's because Paul did not say don't sacrifice at the temple. If you go back and look at it, that's true. He didn't say that. Now, my view is that he didn't want people to sacrifice at the temple if they could avoid it, and that it is metaphor when he talks about Jesus being our sacrifice. But I'll come back to that. So I agree with part of that, but not the whole thing. That where some scholars are saying that Paul was probably okay with sacrifice at the temple. So any talk about Jesus as our sacrifice pre-70, they would say is metaphorical. Post-70, it's more answering the question of what do we do now that the temple's gone? Well, now Jesus is our sacrifice. So if it's post-70, scholars might look at it that way, that it's it's an answer to the question, what do we do now that the temple's gone? Now, the book of Hebrews presents a problem. That's where a lot of the substitutionary language comes in, and that would be several episodes if we were to talk about Hebrews. The Hebrews, scholars are divided on whether it's post-70 or pre-70. So then how you look at it, like, is it just metaphor? Or is it, one scholar I was reading recently said that it's post-70, and it's the first time somebody starts talking about Jesus replacing animal sacrifice. So that scholar, I guess, would see something like penal substitutionary atonement already there in the late 1st century, after the destruction of the temple. Maybe not strictly penal substitutionary atonement the way it arose in the West about 400 or 500 years ago, but at least the groundwork for that in some way. I wasn't quite clear on how he did that, and it was only a part of his paper, so his PhD dissertation. So, and I'm going to quote that scholar later on in this episode. But so Hebrews could be an issue, but that's kind of how scholars are dealing with that. So let's take a musical interlude. Okay, so now we're back again, and I want to talk about my position. And the first thing I want to talk about is how I address the whole issue of Jesus being a replacement for animal sacrifice. Because I don't believe that that's literally what the biblical writers are saying either. I don't think penal substitutionary atonement is what the Bible teaches. Because it may make sense of certain texts, especially Hebrews, and then a few short passages in Paul, and then there's like these a few one-liners in the Gospels that might indicate substitutionary atonement. So it makes sense of those texts, and if that's what's in your head when you read it, then that's what you think it is, that, the Bible's teaching literal penal substitutionary atonement. But then there's a lot of the rest of the Bible that doesn't make sense. A lot of the rest of the New Testament that doesn't make sense. All the participatory language, then it's like you sort of bifurcate the gospel, the New Testament message. I mean, so, and I don't have time to drill down into this, but the main thrust teaching of the New Testament and of the Gospels, I believe, is participatory. And if you want to talk about it in terms of atonement, I don't really use that word because I think that's something that's just risen within religious Christianity. But if you want to talk about atonement, then it's what the New Testament teaches is participatory atonement. Jesus says, "Follow me. Take up the cross and follow me." We are to be crucified with Christ. We are to become sacrifices with Christ. So it's not substitutionary that he is sacrificed instead of us. That's substitutionary. He is sacrificed instead of us. It's participatory. We follow him in the way of the cross. We become sacrifices with him. That makes sense of a lot more of the gospel and of the New Testament than substitutionary. So the few places where it sounds substitutionary, I think those are metaphor. Those are ways of talking, but that are not literal. The ways of talking about what Jesus did that are not literal. And I think the best way to understand this is the way people might understand the sacrifices of soldiers dying in battle. Soldiers are fighting an enemy, but they're not taking the punishment for our sins. I mean, if you think war is an evil, then maybe so, but that's not the way most people will look at it, right? In normal conventional thinking, a soldier that is fighting on our behalf sacrifices for us, is a sacrifice for us, but not a punishment for our sins. Is not taking God's wrath so God doesn't kill us. Maybe taking the enemy's wrath so the enemy doesn't kill us. But we are in solidarity. And in a sense, like you think of World War II for the United States, everybody took part in the war effort, right? That was the whole idea. Like some people went to fight. Other people, especially women, went to work in the factories, and people, grew their victory gardens, and, everybody had a role to play. Everybody made a sacrifice. But for some people, it was the sacrifice of dying on the battlefield. It was the ultimate sacrifice. And that's the way, so when Jesus is talked about as our sacrifice, that I think is what's being understood. And the reason I say that is because this was an idea that was already around in ancient Israel. The Maccabean fighters, the Maccabean freedom fighters, were talked about as sacrifices of atonement. So they weren't, and it wasn't the idea that God was taking out God's wrath on the Maccabean freedom fighters. It was that when they went out there and they made the ultimate sacrifice, that their righteous deed made atonement for their people some way, But it was a way of thinking out somebody that's fighting the enemy for you, that you're in solidarity with, that, you might even follow them into battle, depending on who you are, that person, that you talk about that person in terms of sacrifice. So without getting further into it, that's how I understand the substitutionary language, the sacrificial language in the New Testament. It's the sacrifice of someone fighting for us and that we're in solidarity with, and it actually calls us to follow him into battle. So, but that brings up the whole thing about in ancient Israel, there was already this idea developing that sacrifices aren't necessarily needed. So like the Maccabean freedom fighters were sacrifices. There was this idea that our good deeds are our sacrifices. And that's why Yohanan ben Zakkai, the post-70 rabbi, could say that so easily after the temple was destroyed, because that idea was already there in Israel. And in fact, there was already, I think, abolitionist talk about sacrifices. For example, Isaiah 66, verse 3 reads, "Whoever slaughters an ox is like one who kills a human being. Whoever sacrifices a lamb like one who breaks a dog's neck. Whoever presents a grain offering like one who offers swine's blood. And whoever makes a memorial offering of frankincense like one who blesses an idol. These have chosen their ways, and in their abominations they take delight." That sounds pretty anti-sacrifice to me. That's not just protesting or objecting to the way sacrifice is done. It's opposing sacrifice itself. So these critiques weren't just critiques of the way things were done. These were abolitionist critiques. And it went the range. I'm not saying actually that the Maccabean freedom fighters, calling them sacrifices of atonement, was an abolitionist statement toward sacrifice. But it was the idea germinating, at least. And so I think you had different voices saying different things, but that the idea that we don't really need sacrifices, was there. And there were critiques of the priests, and there were, critiques of the temple and of the corruption. And I think it got to the point of being abolitionist. This is such a power problem that we just don't need it. So that's what I think, that's the beginning of my position. And let's take a musical interlude, and I will come back with the rest of my position. And so we are back. All right, so my argument with a lot of scholars who believe that the early Christians, the early followers of Jesus, were completely okay with sacrifice and the priesthood and the temple, the whole temple establishment. They had no beef with them because they were part of their tradition. My first objection to that is that I don't think those scholars are taking seriously the radical egalitarian teaching of the gospel. In fact, I don't think a lot of them see it. In the Gospels, and you see this clearly in Matthew, Jesus is championing a new radically egalitarian social order. He says the first will be last and the last will be first. We talk about this as the great reversal, but it wasn't a literal reversal. This is hyperbolic talk to describe the leveling of society. The first will be last and the last will be first. The greatest will be everyone's servant. It's the idea that nobody arrogates themselves to positions of power over others. If you want to be great, you've got to be everybody's servant. The outcasts are brought to the center and given the greatest honor. This was the gospel vision. This was the New Testament vision, this radically egalitarian teaching. And to teach that new social order and then to leave the priesthood in place with its sacrificial system, the whole temple establishment in place, that makes no sense. Now, sometimes, progressive or egalitarian movements have blind spots, but that's a big blind spot. And because that was one of the main vehicles of ruling class oppression, of ruling class control. So I think these scholars are not taking the radically egalitarian teaching of the gospel seriously, or are really seeing it clearly. A radical egalitarian position could not leave the priesthood intact. I just don't think it could. So let me make the argument, though, a specific argument of where I see Jesus opposing the priesthood and the sacrificial system, or priesthoods and sacrificial systems and the temple. But we see it because he's operating in Israel. We see it mostly in Israel. First, we have John the Baptizer. And Jesus is baptized by John. But John the Baptizer is baptizing people for repentance of sins at the Jordan River without sacrifice. Now, some scholars have said, well, it didn't mean the people didn't make sacrifices. That could be in tandem with the sacrificial system, sort of a supplement to it. But that's not the way it's said. There's no indication that John is sending people then to the Jerusalem temple to make the appropriate sacrifices. And he's dealing with common people. Most people just, this is one thing, part of my argument too, is that most people just couldn't do that. It was the requirements were too onerous and too expensive, and a lot of peasants were almost destitute. I mean, they were exceedingly poor, barely they were in survival mode, And making sacrifices at the temple just wasn't something they could do. So John was providing a way for them to have forgiveness, to attain a type of purity that was very vital in that society. He was offering a way, and without sacrifices. And Jesus is baptized into this movement, and then he goes on to pronounce people clean and forgiven without the sacrifices. Now, yes, there was the leper incident, and I've talked about that in previous episode, and I'll come right back to it. But before that, I want to remind us of the incident of the paralytic. In that one, he delays the healing in order to pronounce the man forgiven of his sins. Forgiven of his sins. And he does not send that guy to the temple to do sacrifices. He just says, you're forgiven. And then in Matthew, it says that the people praised God because God had given such authority to human beings. In other words, to people, to normal people. That is why they praised God. They didn't praise God because God had given the authority to Jesus. This wasn't about just Jesus having that authority. This isn't a statement about Jesus' divinity. This is Jesus assuming the power of the priesthood. The people were rejoicing because that meant that they weren't at the mercy of the priests, that they didn't have to go to Jerusalem to make the sacrifices, which they couldn't afford, and they didn't have time to afford. That's why they were rejoicing. It says they rejoiced because God had given this authority to human beings, to regular, common people. And that is a phrase that Matthew adds to the story that Mark came first. Mark was written first. Mark has this story. Matthew gets it from Mark. Mark didn't have that clarification in there. I think that was what was implied in the Markan text, but Mark didn't have it. Matthew goes out of his way to add that the people gave glory to God because God had given this authority to the people. So now before that, there is the instance of Jesus encountering the leper. And I've covered this in an earlier episode, but Jesus, however you look at this, Jesus, he does send the guy to the temple to make the appropriate sacrifices with the priest, sends him to the priest of the temple to make the appropriate sacrifices that Moses commanded. However, before that, he pronounces the man clean. He pronounces the man clean. How many times should I say this? Yeah, okay, I'll stop. I could say that over and over. He pronounces the man clean. That is something that only a priest could do, and only after the sacrifices were done. But Jesus takes this authority for himself and pronounces the man clean. And then when he sends him to the priests at the temple, he sends him as a testimony to or against the priests. You could translate it as against. But even if it's to, he's sending a message. What is the message he's sending? Now, Reza Aslan thinks that it's a joke, that Jesus doesn't mean he doesn't really mean for him to go to the temple. This is just a joke because if you go back to Leviticus and you read the passage about the cleansing for a leper, it is onerous. It's like an 8-day process or more, something like that, and it's just got so many steps that even the poor man's version is just too much. And even if they could afford the stuff, the animals and the stuff that you got to bring, most peasants wouldn't have the time for this. They got to be out, hustling, making a living, So Reza Aslan thinks it's a joke. I think he's got a point there. Ched Myers thinks that there was no actual healing that took place, and he's got a good point here because what gets translated leprosy is probably, almost certainly, in fact, not what we call leprosy today, which is a debilitating disease. It was probably just referring to any skin rash or condition like eczema or something like that. that made a person unclean and therefore, marginalized in society. And Jesus is just saying, no, you're clean. They shouldn't say you're not clean. You're clean. He's basically saying, don't marginalize this person. And then he sends them to the priest saying, tell the priest you have a right to those sacrifices. They need to give you because normally the priest would have to look at your skin and say, is the condition gone? If it's gone, then they let you make the sacrifices. He's saying, no. You go and you tell them that you are allowed, that I said you're clean. And like they're going to, recognize the authority of Jesus. Maybe that's the joke. I don't know. But the testimony is a challenge. He's saying this man should be allowed. And that's why in that one instance, it can look like Jesus is, that he's condoning or he's pro-sacrifice. But he's not really pro-sacrifice. He's challenging the power of the priest, because the issue is not whether you're for or against this ritual, this religious ritual. The issue is about power. And in that case, he's challenging the power of the priests. But after that, he never does that again. He never tells anyone else to go to the temple and offer the sacrifices. In fact, in the very next chapter, he heals somebody, he pronounces someone forgiven, and he doesn't send the guy to the temple. And the people praise God because God has given such authority to people, to regular people. So aside from that, we have Jesus twice quoting Hosea, who says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Twice he quotes that. And then toward the very end of the story, one of the last things Jesus does is he goes into the temple and disrupts the whole sacrificial system. He's not chasing out the money changers, because the money changers just aren't supposed to be there according to the law, because they are. If you look, I think it's in Deuteronomy, don't remember the actual text, but in Deuteronomy, they're supposed to be there. He chases them out because he's just done with sacrifice. He stops the whole sacrificial system, and then he brings in the blind and the lame who are not supposed to be in the temple, and he heals them in the temple after he has ended, he has disrupted the whole sacrificial economy. And so I'm going to take this point to take this opportunity to quote a scholar that agrees with me, Warren Carter, whose work I use a lot for this podcast. In his book, Matthew, Storyteller, Interpreter, Evangelist, Carter says that the line from the prophet Hosea that Jesus quotes twice in Matthew, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, is a criticism of the temple's sacrificial system. And he goes on from there and says that his actions of throwing out those who exchanged money and sold doves for sacrifice are an attack on both its exploitative economic practices that benefited the elite high priestly families and on its sacrificial worship. People exchanged money in order to purchase animals for sacrifice. Jesus' actions prevent the temple's function as a place of sacrifice. Instead, Jesus cites Isaiah 56:7 in calling it to be a house of prayer. He welcomes and heals those usually excluded from the temple. These actions indicate that the temple's sacrificial system is no longer needed. End quote. That's at page 196 of Matthew, Storyteller, Interpreter, Evangelist by Warren Carter. And while I'm at it, let me take this opportunity to cite another scholar that seems to agree with me, William E. Arnall, in Jesus and the Village Scribes, commenting on the 10th chapter of Matthew, makes the argument that Q1, the earliest source from which Matthew draws material for his story, Q1 supports direct access to God apart from the formal structures of the temple thereby bypassing, quote, ideological apparatuses that serve to universalize and justify the interests of the cities and of the imperial order in its Judean manifestation, end quote. It's page 198, 199 of Jesus and the Village Scribes. What he means is that this early part of Matthew's source material supports direct access to God, which means bypassing the temple, priests, and sacrificial system, what he calls the apparatuses of the ruling class. So that's pretty close to what I've been saying, although I've not put it in terms of direct access to God, but rather in terms of who has authority to pronounce someone clean and therefore to be in good social standing. That's the way I put it, but it's pretty close. So that's a lot to chew on right there. Let's take a break. Okay, so now we're back. So what about those texts that I cited earlier that scholars use to show that Christians were still sacrificing at the temple? Well, one of them was the leper text in Matthew, and so I addressed that. The one in Acts that has Peter and John going to the temple, that one, it could be that they were going for sacrifice, but it actually says they're going for prayer. And as we just looked at, when Jesus clears the temple of the sacrifice, when he disrupts the sacrificial system, he says this place should be a house of prayer. He quotes Isaiah, says, and he calls for it to be a place of prayer. So there are scholars that say that the early Jesus movement wanted to replace sacrifice with prayer. So it could be that they're going at the time of sacrifice, but they're only going to pray. And that's kind of the way, that's their protest. That's their sort of active protest. They're being, in a way, faithful to the Jewish tradition, but opposing sacrifice. They're going to pray. But the main thing I want to point out, because I'm not going to get into all those texts, and there are others as well, is that we may see a mixed picture, and there's a reason for this. And that is that sacrifice was just too embedded in everyday life for everyone to be able to give it up in every way that they were involved in it. Now, see, part of the problem happens is because we think of this as a religious act. And so religious acts in our world are optional. If you don't do them, there's no real consequence. And for all the talk that we religious people make about being committed and fully committed, and it's optional, and when push comes to shove, it gets shoved all the time. So that's the way we tend to think of, sacrifice. They didn't want to do it, they didn't have to do it. Well, whatever. But what we don't understand is how embedded it was in life. It had to do with people's proper standing in society. It had to do with honor. And as you recall, when I've talked about honor before in this honor-shame society, honor was actually more important than money. Honor was about who you had relationship with, and that could give you access to things like even food and shelter and political rights. And it was very, very important. It was more important than money. Honor was, some have said, that was the true currency of the ancient first century Mediterranean world. Daniel Ulucci, a scholar that I alluded to earlier, didn't say his name, but I just recently read his dissertation, PhD dissertation online. I think he's actually made it into a book, but you have to buy the book, whereas his dissertation is free. So that's the way I went. So in his dissertation, I don't agree with everything he's saying. In fact, he's actually saying a lot of what I'm opposing in this episode he has put into words. So I'm opposing some of what he's saying. But one thing he does that I really appreciate in his dissertation is he's one of the few scholars I've seen do this. He actually looks, one of the few biblical scholars, he actually looks at sacrifice in the Greco-Roman world. So not just within Israel. And he talks about how it was sort of the glue, or part of the glue, that held society together. And I'll just read an excerpt, or this is sort of an excerpt with things cut out, so it's not too long, from his dissertation. He says, civic sacrifice in that time, in the ancient world, reinscribes group membership on several levels. Civic sacrifice indexes family identity. Young men were introduced to the citizen body through sacrificial rituals. These rituals publicly displayed the man's relationship with other citizens and his place in the civic order. Sacrifice also acknowledged the young man's right to claim his father's inheritance. In many cities, citizens were organized into subgroups for the purposes of administration or representation. They were always sacrificial groups. Membership in these groups united families within the city. Marriages and funerals also had their parallel public sacrifices. Men announced their marriages to the citizen body in sacrificial rituals. Thus, the community bore witness to a woman's new family status and the potential status of her children. Communal funeral rites united families to their descendants. So sacrifice was just in every part of life, and it bonded. The way he talks about it is it bonded communities together. That was the role of sacrifice. It wasn't just about forgiveness of sins as we think about it. It certainly was not just a religious act in the way we think of religion. It was a part of society. And so therefore, asking people to give it up was a tall order. And not everybody could do that. And so I think that's why you see some of them, what we might think of as mixed messages in the New Testament, because some people were able to. A lot of Jesus' original disciples were so poor they had never been able to participate in the first place, so they could do it. Some people were more radical, but other people maybe were at different stages, were withdrawing from parts of the sacrificial system, but not other parts. And by the way, you see in the gospel, you see we get these very strong statements of commitment that sound like it's all or nothing. Anyone who comes after me must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. It's all or nothing. But in the same chapter, it will say, but if you give a cup of water to one of these little ones, because they're my disciple, you'll certainly get your reward. So even little acts are recognized. Even though Jesus says, if you come after me, you must deny yourself. If you don't, you're not worthy of me. Peter, the quintessential disciple, fails to follow Jesus to the cross and denies Jesus as Jesus is on trial. He denies knowing him. Peter, the quintessential disciple, fails at that all or nothing thing, and yet he becomes a leader in the church. In fact, it's stated in Matthew that way. Jesus says, on this rock I will build my church, indicating Peter. So, we can't take all the hyperbolic talk in the gospel completely literally. We have to understand it in its emotional force. It has truth there. There's truth that we can get from it, but we can't take it literally. We have to understand that a lot of it is hyperbole, and that people were at different places. The centurion, Jesus says, he comes and bows before Jesus so that Jesus will heal his son or his servant, however you translate that word. And Jesus says, greater faith I have not found in Israel. But we don't know what the centurion does after that. Does he keep serving as a centurion? Does he become a disciple of Jesus? It doesn't say that. So there really actually is, in the early communities, a place for people at different levels of commitment. So it could be that some people had quit sacrifice altogether. Some people had never participated in it. Other people were withdrawing from it where they could. But you could get then descriptions of people participating in it at different levels and or in different ways. And it would have made sense to the people there in the original context. They would have understood that, whereas for us, it doesn't seem to quite make sense. But let me compare it to something in our world which might help it make sense. So many people in our society who think of themselves as progressive or even radical are opposed to, if not capitalism itself, a lot of the institutions of capitalism, like especially the large corporations. But almost every progressive or radical that I know still buys things from large corporations, shops in corporate grocery stores. I know people that are progressive and they don't like they oppose the power and the dominance of large corporations like Amazon, but they order from Amazon. I try not to order from Amazon, but in a pinch, I'll have to say that I might do it. I haven't done it in a while, but I recently found out that this podcast is being broadcast partly through Amazon, through that service. So some of you may be listening to this on Amazon. Progressives and radicals, many will put gasoline in their cars, even though we know that contributes to oil wars and climate change, and we're concerned about that. And we want to get away from oil, yet we will drive our cars, right? In my daily life, I ride a bike, but yesterday we needed to go down to San Diego to visit my wife's family, and we couldn't take the train, which we usually do, because we usually take bike and train, but because of the pandemic, we can't take the train, so we drove. We have a co-op where we have one car, and we took that car. We put gas in it, contributed to oil wars and climate change, and we did it. So now imagine trying to explain this to somebody 2,000 years in the future when we've completely gotten away from capitalism and solved all these problems. We no longer have these issues, and they're looking at it saying, wait a minute, you opposed the excesses of capitalism, the wars it caused, the environmental degradation, the disparities in wealth, and people, and the 1% was making $1 trillion while people were getting evicted from their homes during a pandemic. And you still participated in that system. You bought things in their grocery stores, and you put gas in your tank, and you used money. You participated in the system while that was going on, and yet you said you were against it. Yeah, because it makes sense to us, because we know that we can oppose it. We know that we can be opposed either to the whole capitalist system, or at least to a lot of its institutions, the large corporations. But at the same time, we don't live everything we believe, or we've just got to survive in the world. We've got to do what we've got to do. And, you got to live to fight another day, right? We understand it in our context. That's the way it was. That's the way sacrifice, I think, was for them. It was everywhere. It was embedded. And so some people at certain times are going to participate in it in different ways, even though the thrust of the movement was to reject it and to have a new social order that didn't have priests, that didn't put onerous demands for sacrifice on people who couldn't afford it. And if you couldn't do it, then you had a lower status, or you didn't have any honor. In general, the movement was against that whole system. But people might still participate in it. People who had been participating in it before it might take them a while to extract themselves from it. They might never do it. They might only partially do it before they died. And that's the way it was. So we still oppose things that we disagree with or oppose systems that we disagree with while participating in them. But we can look to the poorest and most marginalized people like Jesus and his original disciples, as those who point the way to liberation. So I want to leave it there. Thank you for listening to this very long episode, but I think it's an important one. It was long, but it's an important one. And this has been a special episode of Bible study, parody, and subversion in Matthew's Gospel.